He was just a human to her. Until he moved mountains to protect her. Have you ever wondered what would happen if love didn't come from your heart, but from the very fabric of the universe itself? What if love wasn't just an emotion between two people, but a force, a cosmic connection that could bridge worlds, planets, galaxies, even species? Imagine, what if love didn't come from the person beside you, but from someone or something completely other? This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't just another science fiction story. This is the truth Caden Drake is about to face when he crashes on the hostile world of Savon, a place where the laws of nature bend, where survival isn't just about food, but about the very essence of existence. He thinks he's just an ordinary man. But in a jungle that pulses with life, in a world on the edge of destruction, Caden will discover that his heart isn't just beating for survival. It's beating for something far beyond what he ever thought possible. And the worst part? The very love he feels might be the catalyst for the greatest war the universe has ever known. Can a human love an alien? Can their love survive the unraveling of an entire planet's fate? As the Source awakens, Caden's fate will be sealed. But at what cost? You have to stay with me until the end, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about love, time, and space. This is no ordinary love story. It's an intergalactic heart-shattering adventure you won't want to miss. The freighter hull tore apart with a deafening crash, its metal groaning under the strain. It was like a tin can being crushed by an unseen hand, the hull splitting wide open. Black smoke billowed from the engines, curling into the thick copper sky of Savon. The ship had been struck by something unknown, and now it lay wrecked on the jungle floor. Caden Cross, Earth-born and Earth-trained, fought to push himself up from the debris. His flight suit was torn across the chest, exposing his pale skin. Sweat, blood, and the glowing iridescent fuel spilled during the crash covered him like a second skin. His muscles screamed in protest as he attempted to move. Savon's gravity, twice that of Earth, made every step feel like a battle. Each movement, no matter how small, drained the life out of him. His bones felt heavy, and his mind foggy. He had to get up. He had to keep moving. There was no other choice. Not after everything he'd lost. His vision blurred. The weight of his memories crushed him. Sarah. Emma. The faces of his family, lost to him in an instant. His mind flickered to the crash back on Earth, the broken crane, the snapped cables. The moment the steel beams came crashing down. The sound of metal shattering, the sickening silence that followed. He hadn't been able to save them. He had failed them. A sharp pain shot through his temple as blood trickled down his face, dripping onto the alien soil. The liquid hissed, sizzling where it touched the ground, as though the planet itself rejected him. It was a sign. A reminder that he was on a world far from home, where the rules were different. The air burned his lungs with every breath he took. There was no time for rest. No time for grief. Caden forced himself to stand, his knees shaking with the effort. He glanced around, trying to make sense of the wreckage. The ship had carved a brutal path through the dense crimson jungle. Broken trees and scattered debris painted a trail of destruction, and small fires still burned in the aftermath of the crash. He staggered forward, each step a struggle. His flight suit, torn and battered, felt heavier with every movement. The jungle around him pulsed with an eerie rhythm, its strange vegetation swaying as if alive. Every noise sent his nerves on edge. Every rustle of leaves felt like the approach of something far more dangerous than the wreck. Suddenly, a shadow moved above him. The jungle shifted, and someone was watching him. He froze. There was no sound, but the presence was unmistakable. A figure stood on a rocky outcrop, eyes glowing silver and intense. Her skin was a deep azure blue, shimmering under the harsh light of Savon's twin suns. Her long, silver hair, braided intricately, swayed gently with the breeze. She was tall and imposing, yet there was something fluid in her movements, a predator's grace. Caden's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his chest. There was no mistaking it. She wasn't human. Not by any stretch of the imagination. She tilted her head, studying him with a piercing gaze. For a moment, they both just stared at each other. The air between them felt thick with unspoken tension. He was a stranger here, an outsider in this strange world. "You're fragile," she called out, her voice melodic yet cold, filled with disdain. "You'll snap in our gravity. Like a twig." Caden gritted his teeth, forcing his body to move despite the pain. "I've survived worse," he rasped, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. She let out a low, mocking laugh. "Not here, you haven't." Her eyes narrowed, and in one smooth motion, she leapt down from the outcrop. Caden's instincts kicked in, but he didn't move. She was fast, too fast, and she landed gracefully in front of him, her long limbs unfolding with the fluidity of a predatory animal. Her gaze never left him. "I suggest you lie down," she said, her tone almost amused. "There's no point in fighting. Savon doesn't give second chances." Caden didn't reply. He couldn't. Her words, though harsh, rang with the truth. The weight of this planet was suffocating. He felt it in every breath, in every strained movement. But there was something in her, something that intrigued him. Something he couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice rough and raw. She paused, her silver eyes glinting. For a moment, there was no response. Then she tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "My name is Astra," she said simply, her voice still laced with that same melodic tone. "And you, Earthman, are in my world now." Astra's eyes were unreadable as she watched Caden struggle to find his footing. The air between them was thick, not just with the stifling humidity of Savon, but with something more, something intangible. Caden could feel it, a pressure in the air, as though the planet itself was holding its breath. She didn't speak for a long moment, just watching him, her silver eyes narrowing slightly in consideration. Caden, despite the pain coursing through his body, straightened. His legs trembled beneath him, but his willpower kept him upright. "I'm not staying here," he rasped, voice hoarse. "I don't care what your world does to me." Astra didn't flinch. Her expression remained cold, calculating. She took a step closer, the ground beneath her barely shifting. "You don't get to choose, Earthman. Not here." Caden's pulse quickened, but he fought the urge to back away. Savon was foreign, its dangers unfamiliar, but he wasn't going to let it break him. He couldn't. Not again. Not after everything he had already lost. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I just need to survive." Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Survive," she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "You'll need more than that on Savon." For a moment, there was silence. Then, to Caden's surprise, Astra spoke again, this time with a trace of something softer, perhaps pity, perhaps a strange form of respect. "If you want to survive, you'll have to learn how to fight," she said. And you'll need to learn quickly. This place, it doesn't wait for the weak. She turned and began to walk away, her long limbs moving with ease, the way a predator would stalk its prey. Caden watched her, torn between anger and curiosity. He had to follow. He had no choice. His ship was gone, his crew scattered or dead, and the jungle, it was closing in on him. The first few hours of travel with Astra were silent. She moved through the jungle with an ease that Caden could never hope to match. Her steps were light, almost soundless. He, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. The gravity of Savon dragged at him with every step, and his body, sore and battered from the crash, didn't help. His legs burned, his muscles screamed for relief, but he kept pushing forward. There was no other choice. Astra didn't look back, didn't slow down. She didn't have to. Caden's mind raced with thoughts. He had questions, so many questions. Who was she? Why was she here? What was her agenda? And most pressing of all, why was she helping him at all? The crash had been no accident. It couldn't have been. But Astra had shown no sign of hostility. If anything, she had almost seemed intrigued by him. He needed to understand why. Finally, as the thick jungle canopy opened up to reveal a clearing, Caden spoke. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "You've made it clear you think I'm weak. Why not just leave me here to die?" Astra stopped, her back still to him. The air was still, but the tension was palpable, as if the very jungle was holding its breath. She turned slowly, her silver eyes reflecting the faint light of the alien sun. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, her voice came, low and steady. "Because you're different," she said simply. "I don't know why. But you are." Her gaze softened, just slightly, but enough for Caden to notice. He frowned. "Different?" Astra nodded, then turned back to face the dense jungle ahead. "We all have our reasons for surviving, Earthman. Yours will come in time." Caden didn't respond, but the words stuck with him. Different. He wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or a warning. Either way, he wasn't here to make friends. He was here to survive. They traveled for hours. The thick trees of Savon seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the scent of unfamiliar plants and the low hum of alien creatures. The jungle was alive in a way Caden had never experienced before. Every sound was amplified, every rustle of the leaves carrying a warning of danger. At one point, Astra stopped and motioned for Caden to be quiet. Her ears perked up, and her silver eyes scanned the surroundings. Caden froze, every instinct screaming at him to listen, to stay alert. Then, the growl came. Deep, primal, and angry. Astra stepped forward, her movements smooth, like she had done this 1,000 times before. She raised her spear, holding it with an ease that spoke of years of training. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice low. Before Caden could even respond, the beast emerged from the jungle, a creature the size of a small tank, its eyes glowing yellow. Its body was covered in thick, leathery armor, with spikes protruding from its back like a living fortress. The creature sniffed the air, its massive claws dragging through the dirt as it began to circle them. Astra didn't wait for it to make the first move. She lunged forward, her spear a blur in the air. The creature roared in pain as the tip of her spear found its mark, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It charged, its heavy body crashing toward them. Caden didn't think. He just reacted. His body, though exhausted, moved on instinct. He ran to intercept the beast, diving toward its front legs and slamming his shoulder into its armored hide. The impact was brutal. Pain surged through him, but the creature faltered, thrown off balance by the unexpected attack. Astra's voice rang out, urgent, sharp. "Get back," she yelled, darting forward with a grace that almost seemed unnatural. Caden didn't wait. He rolled out of the way just in time as Astra's spear drove deep into the creature's throat, piercing its armor and silencing its roar. The beast collapsed with a final, guttural growl, and then, silence. Caden lay there, panting, his chest heaving. He looked up at Astra, who was already standing, her expression unreadable as always. "That," she said, wiping her spear clean, "was a test." Caden nodded, breathless but still aware. He had passed. But for how long? The next few days passed in a blur of sweat, bruises, and the crushing weight of Savon's gravity. Caden's body had grown accustomed to the constant ache, but the strain never truly let up. Astra led the way, her pace unyielding as she navigated the dense jungle, her eyes ever watchful, her movements precise. Caden followed, each step harder than the last, but there was no other choice. He had to keep moving, no matter how much it hurt. They didn't speak much. Words were unnecessary. The jungle spoke to them in its own way through rustling leaves, the distant growl of a predator, or the sudden, jarring silence that fell over everything. One evening, as the red sun began to set and the air grew heavy with the promise of a storm, Astra stopped. She turned to Caden, her silver eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "You're slowing down," she observed, her voice as emotionless as ever. "This planet is breaking you." Caden clenched his jaw, not wanting to show weakness. He had to prove himself. To her. To himself. "I'm fine," he said, though it wasn't true. His legs felt like lead, his chest tight with every breath. He wanted to collapse, to sink into the ground and never get up. But there was no time for that. Not here. Astra didn't seem convinced. She glanced at the sky, and for a moment, Caden thought he saw a flicker of something, a flash of regret, perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Fine," she said simply. "Rest for tonight. But tomorrow, we continue." Caden didn't argue. He sank down onto the soft, moss-covered ground, his back against a tree. The air smelled faintly of decay, a reminder of how alien this world was. As night fell, the jungle came alive with strange noises. The sounds of creatures, some distant, some too close for comfort, echoed through the trees. Caden closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the alien sounds only grew louder. The world was suffocating. And then, in the distance, he heard something different. A low hum. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, closer. Caden opened his eyes and turned to Astra, who was already on her feet, her posture tense. She wasn't listening to the sounds of the jungle anymore. She was listening to something else. "What is that?" Caden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Astra didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her spear and motioned for him to follow. They moved silently through the jungle, the hum growing louder with each step. The trees began to thin out, revealing a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood an enormous structure, tall, angular, and unlike anything Caden had ever seen before. It looked almost mechanical, as if it had been built by something far beyond human technology. A sleek, metallic surface gleamed in the dim light, and the hum seemed to be emanating from deep within it. Caden's heart pounded. What is this? Astra's gaze was fixed on the structure. An old ruin. One of many on Savon. Caden couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The hum was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. It felt like it was calling to him, beckoning him closer. Astra stepped forward. Don't touch anything, she warned. It's dangerous. But Caden was already moving toward the structure. He didn't know why. There was something about it that felt familiar. Something that pulled him in, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Before Astra could stop him, he reached out and touched the surface of the structure. The moment his fingers made contact, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft light flickered from within the structure, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Caden's pulse quickened. He could feel the power radiating from it, like a pulse in his very bones. And then, the ground beneath them began to shake. Astra grabbed Caden's arm, pulling him away from the structure. We need to leave, she hissed, her voice full of urgency. But it was too late. The sky overhead darkened, and a low rumble echoed through the ground. The ground cracked open, splitting apart as if the planet itself was being torn apart. From the depths, a massive shape began to rise, its form shifting in the darkness. The jungle around them began to retreat, the trees bending back as if in fear. Move! Astra shouted, her grip tightening on Caden's arm as she pulled him into motion. But it was no use. The ground continued to tremble beneath them, and the creature, whatever it was coming closer. Caden's heart raced. The air was thick with fear. He didn't know what this was. Didn't know what kind of danger they were in. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about surviving on Savon anymore. Something far bigger, far more dangerous, was waking up. The earth trembled beneath their feet, the ground splitting apart like the cracking of glass. Caden could feel the vibrations pulse through his entire body, each tremor more violent than the last. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as he struggled to keep his footing. Astra was already moving, pulling him away from the wreckage of the structure with surprising speed. But Caden couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight before him. The ground was cracking wide open, and from the depths, something massive was beginning to emerge. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. A creature? A machine? Or something else entirely? The shape was enormous, its form shifting in the darkness like a monstrous shadow. It moved with an eerie fluidity, rising up from the depths of Savon's crust, its eyes glowing a faint blue, casting an unnatural light over the jungle around them. Caden felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary predator. This was something ancient. Something powerful. Run! Astra shouted, her voice sharp, full of urgency. Caden barely had time to react before Astra yanked him forward, pulling him toward the trees. The ground continued to crack open, sending jagged rocks shooting up into the air, each explosion of debris shaking the jungle. The hum that had once filled the air returned, louder now, as though it was coming from the creature itself. The trees around them began to fall back, bending and twisting as if some unseen force was pushing them aside. The jungle was retreating in fear. What is it? Caden gasped, trying to keep up with Astra. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs threatening to buckle beneath him. Astra's eyes were wide, her silver pupils dilated. It's called the Talker, an ancient creature of Savon. Once, it ruled this world. Caden's mind raced. What do we do? Astra didn't hesitate. She reached for a small device at her side, her fingers moving quickly as she activated it. A low beep sounded, followed by a faint vibration in the air. We move faster, she said grimly, looking over her shoulder at the growing chaos behind them. We can't fight it. We need to get to the edge of the rift. Caden wasn't sure what that meant, but he didn't question her. The sight of the talker rising from the depths was enough to know that nothing was safe here. The jungle itself seemed to be running away from the beast, as if it knew what kind of destruction it could cause. The ground split further as the talker roared, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the very atmosphere. The trees around them twisted and cracked, falling under the weight of the monster's presence. With each step it took, the jungle seemed to shrivel, as though its very life force was being drained by this ancient terror. Astra pulled him through the thick brush, her expression tight with determination. Stay close. Do not look back. Caden nodded, his mind racing as the talker's shape became clearer. It was a massive, serpentine creature, its body covered in rough, alien scales. Its eyes glowed bright blue, and each step it took left deep cracks in the earth. The air around it shimmered with energy, like it was creating a force field, a barrier that bent the light itself. The talker was more than just a creature. It was a force of nature. As they pushed forward, the jungle began to thin. The trees became sparse, and the land sloped upward, toward what Astra had called the edge of the rift. Caden could barely keep up as the ground beneath them shifted, the pressure of the planet's gravity making every step feel like a struggle. But Astra was a blur of movement, leading the way with precision, her spear gripped tightly in her hand. Keep moving, she shouted over the roar of the creature behind them. Caden pushed himself harder. The air was thick, and every breath felt like it was being stolen from him. He had never experienced anything like this before. His entire body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. Not now. Not with the talker on their trail. The sound of the talker's roar grew louder, closer, and Caden could feel the vibrations in the air as it charged toward them. They were running out of time. Astra's voice cut through his thoughts. We're almost there. Don't stop. Just ahead, Caden saw the rift, a massive crack in the ground, stretching as far as the eye could see. The air around it was dense, filled with an unnatural energy. The jungle had stopped at the edge, the plants there twisted and gnarled, like they were trying to avoid the rift's pull. They had reached the threshold. Astra turned sharply, her silver eyes flashing. Get ready, she said, her voice low. She glanced at Caden, her expression more serious than he had ever seen. This is where we make our stand. The talker was almost upon them. It leapt forward, its massive body crashing into the ground with the force of 100 storms. The ground shook beneath their feet, sending rocks flying into the air. Caden barely had time to brace himself as the beast's shadow loomed over them. Astra stepped forward, raising her spear. Caden wasn't sure what she planned to do, but one thing was certain, Astra wasn't running anymore. She was ready to face the talker head-on. The creature let out another roar, its glowing eyes fixed on them, its massive jaws opening wide, ready to crush them both. Caden's heart pounded in his chest. There was no time to think. The rift was their only hope. The ground shook with the force of the talker's roar. Caden's heart raced, his breath shallow as he watched the creature advance, its eyes glowing a deep, unnatural blue. It was closer now, its massive body crashing through the dense jungle as if it were nothing more than a blade cutting through soft tissue. Astra didn't hesitate. Her silver eyes locked onto the creature, her grip tightening on her spear. She stepped forward, her body poised for action, every muscle tense. Caden followed instinctively, his pulse pounding in his ears. There was no more running. "Get ready," Astra whispered, her voice steady but her expression hard as steel. "We'll fight." Caden didn't have time to question her decision. The talker was upon them. He barely registered Astra's words before the beast lunged, its jaws snapping with terrifying speed. Caden reacted instinctively. He dove to the side, just as the massive creature's maw slammed into the ground where he had been standing only seconds before. The force of the impact sent a shock wave through the earth, throwing Caden off balance and sending him tumbling through the dirt. The talker's eyes narrowed, focusing on Caden now, as if sensing his vulnerability. Its massive body shifted, its claws digging into the earth as it prepared for another attack. But Astra was faster. With a movement too quick for Caden to fully follow, Astra darted forward, her spear raised high. She leapt onto the talker's back, driving the spear deep into the beast's thick, leathery hide. The creature screamed, a sound that rattled the jungle, and began to thrash violently, trying to throw her off. Caden scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't just stand there. He had to help her. But the talker was like a mountain, and Astra was a speck on its massive back. He glanced around desperately, searching for anything that could help. There was no time. The talker's tail whipped through the air, narrowly missing Astra as it lashed out in a blind fury. Caden's heart skipped a beat. The creature was growing more frantic, its movements more unpredictable. The air crackled with energy, as if Savon itself was responding to the beast's rage. Astra gritted her teeth as she struggled to hold onto her spear. "Caden!" "The rift," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need to get it to the rift. Now." "The rift." Caden's gaze flicked to the massive crack in the earth, its edges shimmering with an eerie light. There was no time to think. He had no plan, no strategy, but Astra had saved his life more than once. If she said the rift was their only chance, he had to trust her. "Move!" Astra shouted again, barely clinging to her weapon as the talker shook violently beneath her. Caden didn't hesitate. He ran, his legs heavy with exhaustion but driven by something deeper: survival, the need to survive, and protect whatever was left of this world. The talker turned, its massive head swinging toward him. Its glowing eyes locked on Caden, and for a moment, he felt like the prey. But then, something shifted in the air. The talker hesitated. A low hum echoed from deep within the rift, vibrating through the ground like a pulse. Caden felt the earth beneath him tremble in response. It was as if the planet itself was awakening, answering the call of the creature. The rift, it was alive. Astra saw it too. She lunged forward, her spear plunging deep into the creature's side. The talker howled in pain, its massive body arching in agony. But it was too late. The rift had been triggered. The ground beneath them cracked open wider, the edges of the rift glowing bright blue as the creature's massive body began to be pulled toward it. The hum grew louder, the energy of the rift swirling around them, its gravitational pull starting to drag everything in its wake. Caden's stomach turned as the force of the rift yanked at him, but he held his ground. Astra, too, seemed to be fighting against the pull, her feet dug into the earth as she tried to maintain her position. But the talker was no match for the rift's power. With one final, desperate roar, the creature was pulled into the chasm, its massive body disappearing into the crack in the earth. The jungle fell silent, the tension dissipating as the hum of the rift slowly faded. The energy that had once been so overwhelming now seemed to recede into the ground, leaving only a quiet, unsettling stillness behind. Caden collapsed to his knees, his body exhausted from the battle. His chest heaved with each breath, the weight of the last few hours crushing him. Astra, too, was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "It's over," Astra said quietly, though there was no joy in her voice. "For now." Caden didn't reply. He was too shaken to speak. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his forehead, his body aching with every movement. The talker was gone. The rift had done its job, but at what cost? "Come on," Astra said, her voice more gentle now. She offered him a hand, her silver eyes softening for the first time since they had met. "We're not out of danger yet." Caden took her hand, allowing her to pull him to his feet. There was still so much to be done. The rift was a powerful force, but it wasn't their salvation. They had survived this battle, but the real fight was just beginning. The silence that followed was suffocating. Caden stood still, his body trembling with the aftermath of the battle. His mind barely registered the fading hum of the rift, or the fact that the jungle around them had returned to an eerie stillness. For a moment, it felt like everything had frozen in time. The chaos, the danger, the life and death struggle now felt distant, as though it had never really happened. But it had. It was real. The talker was gone, swallowed by the rift. And they had survived. But at what cost? Astra, still gripping her spear tightly, scanned the clearing. Her silver eyes were sharp, alert as ever, though a flicker of something that looked like exhaustion flashed across her face. She was already moving again, her pace quick, purposeful. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice calm, yet there was a quiet urgency beneath it. Caden nodded, still trying to catch his breath. He wanted to ask her about the rift, about the talker and how it all connected. But his body was too tired to keep up with his thoughts. Instead, he let Astra take the lead once more, following her as she weaved through the jungle with ease, her every step filled with purpose. The forest, once oppressive with its dangers, now felt oddly empty. The air was still heavy with tension, but the creatures that had once seemed so close, so dangerous, were now gone. The jungle had fallen silent, almost as if it was mourning the loss of the talker, or perhaps, it was just recovering from the disturbance. Astra led them to a small, secluded clearing. There, she stopped and turned to face Caden. Her eyes were unreadable, her expression hard to decipher. For a moment, they just stood there, the space between them thick with unspoken words. "You're wondering why I didn't tell you everything about the rift," Astra said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. Caden's gaze met hers. He hadn't asked, but he didn't have to. It was written all over his face. The questions, the doubts, the uncertainty. Astra's lips pressed into a thin line. "The rift is not just a hole in the ground," she continued. "It's something else. Something ancient. The talker was bound to it. Its power. It was meant to stay buried." Caden frowned. "Bound to it? You mean the talker wasn't just a creature? It was a prisoner?" Astra nodded, her expression hardening. "The talker was created to guard the rift. It wasn't meant to be unleashed. It was a weapon, an ancient force designed to keep the rift sealed. But something woke it up." Caden took a step closer, trying to understand. "And we triggered it?" Astra's gaze flickered to the rift in the distance, where the ground still seemed to pulse with energy, faintly glowing. Not just you. Savon itself responded to your arrival. The moment you touched that structure, the balance shifted. And the talker, it was free. Caden swallowed hard. The idea that his crash, his very presence on Savon, had been enough to set everything in motion, it was overwhelming. The guilt began to creep in again, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for guilt. They needed to figure out what came next. So, what happens now? He asked, his voice quieter than before. Astra's eyes softened, just for a moment. Now, we figure out how to survive. Again. She didn't say it like a question, but Caden could hear the weight in her words. She had fought for survival her whole life. But this was different. The talker was only the beginning. Whatever the rift had unleashed, whatever it was hiding, was still out there. And they needed to be ready. Astra turned away and began to walk again. This time, Caden didn't need her to say anything. He knew. He followed her without a word, as the jungle seemed to swallow them whole once more. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Caden felt the weight of their situation sink in. The talker was gone, but something else was out there. And the rift, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an ancient, dormant force. It felt like a ticking clock, one that had only just begun to count down. Caden couldn't help but think of Earth, of the family he had lost. He thought of Emma, her small hand waving at him from the observation deck, and Sarah, her voice so full of life. He had failed them. But now, he had to survive. For them. For himself. But survival on Savon was no simple task. The jungle was still full of dangers unseen, deadly. And Astra, though capable, was as much a mystery to him as the planet itself. Her strength was undeniable, but her past? Her connection to Savon? That was still a story left untold. They moved through the jungle in silence for what felt like hours, the air thick with the scent of alien plants and the distant calls of creatures they couldn't see. But Caden's mind was elsewhere. He thought of the rift, of the talker, and of the strange, ancient structure they had encountered. What was the connection? And why had Savon responded to him the way it had? He didn't have the answers. Not yet. The night had fallen over Savon, and the jungle around them was alive again, though in a way that felt more haunting than natural. The dense canopy above blocked most of the pale moonlight, casting the world below into an almost impenetrable darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every distant cry of unseen creatures, sent a shiver down Caden's spine. It was a constant reminder of how alone they were. How far from home. Astra led the way through the jungle with the ease of someone who had lived this life for years. She didn't stop to rest, didn't hesitate when the path grew rough. Her every step seemed calculated, precise, while Caden stumbled behind, his legs heavy with fatigue, his thoughts racing. It wasn't long before they came to a river. The water flowed swiftly, its surface dark under the moon. The current was strong, and Caden could see shadows darting just beneath the surface. Large, silvery fish, he assumed, but he didn't dare get too close. The jungle had taught him that curiosity could be deadly here. Astra didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the edge of the river, crouching down to inspect something in the water. Caden joined her, though he kept a wary distance. "Astra," he said, his voice hoarse. "What exactly are we looking for?" Her silver eyes flicked up to meet his, a faint glint of amusement in her gaze. "An old route," she said, her voice quiet but firm. One that will lead us to safety. Safety. Caden repeated, skeptical. You've said that before. But I still don't know where we're going. Astra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued to scan the riverbank, her gaze flicking back and forth as if searching for something only she could see. After a few moments, she stood and turned to face him. This place is complicated, she said, her tone softening just a little. The rift isn't just a place. It's a doorway. And Savon. Savon isn't just a planet. It's a battleground. The talker was a guardian, yes, but there are more. They were all created to protect something. Something that's still buried deep beneath the surface. Caden frowned, struggling to follow. Guardians. Protect what? Astra didn't answer, instead stepping forward and drawing her hand through the water, causing a ripple to form in its depths. The water parted, revealing a strange, glowing symbol etched into a rock beneath the surface. The glow was faint, barely noticeable, but it pulsed with an eerie energy that felt far too familiar. Astra, what is that? Caden asked, his voice laced with apprehension. She turned to face him again, her expression unreadable. This is where the route begins. Without another word, Astra moved toward the symbol, her fingers brushing against the glowing surface of the rock. The water rippled, and with a soft, low hum, the symbol began to shift. The rock underneath them trembled, and a hidden passageway slowly revealed itself, extending deep beneath the river. Caden's breath caught in his throat. What is this place? An ancient passage, Astra replied, her voice low. It was built long ago, by the ones who created the Guardians. It will take us closer to what we need. Caden stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing with questions. But Astra was already moving, slipping into the narrow opening without hesitation. Caden hesitated for only a second before following her. He didn't know what awaited them at the end of this path. But he knew one thing for sure, the deeper they went into Savon, the closer they came to something far more dangerous than the jungle had ever shown them. The passage was narrow and winding, the walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, glowing fungi that seemed to pulse with life. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faintest hint of something metallic. Caden could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of Savon pressing in on all sides. But Astra moved ahead with ease, as though this path was a part of her. She had been here before. Is it always like this? Caden asked, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow passage. Astra glanced over her shoulder, her silver eyes catching the faint glow of the fungi. Yes, she said simply. It's always been like this. The old ones knew how to hide their secrets well. Caden swallowed, trying to ignore the rising tension in his chest. There was something about this place that felt wrong. The silence was too complete. The darkness too consuming. Every step felt like a mistake, but there was no turning back now. They continued through the passage, the walls becoming more irregular, the air growing warmer with each step. The hum in the air was becoming louder, more persistent, and Caden could feel it vibrating through his entire body. It was like the heart of Savon itself was beating beneath their feet. Finally, they reached the end of the passage, a large chamber, its ceiling towering above them. The room was dark, save for the faint glow coming from the walls, revealing symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room was an altar, large and imposing, made of a material that shimmered in the dim light. Caden felt his pulse quicken. What is this place? Astra stepped forward, Her eyes locked onto the altar. "This is where it began," she said softly. "Where the Guardians were created. Where Savon's fate was sealed." Caden didn't understand. "Guardians? Fate? What do you mean?" Astra didn't answer right away. Instead, she knelt before the altar, her fingers brushing against the smooth, glowing surface. "The Old Ones built this world. They created the Guardians to protect the Source. But something went wrong. The rift wasn't meant to be opened. And now everything is falling apart." Caden's mind raced. The Source? Was that what the talker had been guarding? And what had Astra meant by everything falling apart? Before he could ask, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The walls began to vibrate. Caden's heart skipped a beat. "We're not alone," Astra said, her voice low. "And neither is Savon." The rumble that echoed through the chamber grew louder, its vibrations shaking the very ground beneath Caden's feet. He glanced at Astra, who stood with her hand resting on the altar, her expression unreadable. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse in rhythm with the tremors, their faint glow intensifying as if responding to the growing energy in the room. "What's happening?" Caden asked, his voice barely rising above the rumble of the chamber. Astra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step back from the altar, her eyes scanning the room as if she was expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "The Source," she said softly, "it's awakening." The air around them thickened, and Caden could feel a strange pull toward the altar. It was as if the chamber itself was alive, the walls breathing with a silent, slow rhythm, the hum deepening to a low, unsettling growl. The rift had triggered something powerful, and now it was stirring beneath them, waking up after centuries of slumber. Astra's hand clenched around the spear at her side. "We need to leave. Now." Caden didn't need to be told twice. He moved quickly, following Astra as she turned and hurried toward the passage they had come from. But as they reached the entrance, the ground trembled again, this time with such force that the stone walls cracked, sending dust and debris tumbling to the floor. A loud, piercing sound filled the air like 1,000 voices screaming, a cacophony of sound that made Caden's head spin. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ears, his mind struggling to make sense of the overwhelming noise. Astra was already moving, pulling him to his feet. "We have to go. The Source is awakening. If we don't leave now, we're finished." Caden nodded, barely hearing her over the noise. His head felt like it was about to explode, the pressure building in his skull as they ran through the passage, the walls shaking violently with each step. The world around them seemed to be collapsing in on itself. The ground cracked open, sending waves of energy rippling through the air. They burst out of the passage just as the jungle erupted in chaos. The trees around them shook violently, their trunks twisting as if they were alive. The very earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble in fear. And then, in the distance, Caden saw it. A massive, swirling vortex of energy like a storm, but not a storm of wind or rain. This was something else. Something ancient, and far more dangerous. The Source. It's happening," Caden gasped, staring at the vortex as it spiraled above them, a column of light that reached high into the sky. The air around them crackled with raw energy, the ground beneath them starting to shift. Astra didn't waste a second. She grabbed Caden's arm and began pulling him away from the clearing, her face set with a fierce determination. "We need to get to the outpost, now. It's the only place that might still be safe." Caden didn't argue. He followed her, running as fast as he could, his body screaming with every step. The jungle seemed to fight them, the trees and plants twisting in unnatural directions, trying to block their path, as if Savon itself was alive and intent on stopping them. The vortex continued to grow in size, the swirling light brighter now, casting long, jagged shadows across the jungle. The hum of the energy resonated in Caden's chest, each beat of the pulse sending a ripple of pain through his body. "Stay close," Astra shouted, pulling him forward as the ground beneath them began to buckle, the earth splitting open in jagged cracks. The vortex above them raged, its energy intensifying with every passing second. Caden's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what the source was, or why it was awakening now, but he knew one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't something they could fight. It was beyond anything they could possibly understand. "We're almost there," Astra called out, her voice strained, the strain of the journey clear in her every movement. They pushed forward, finally reaching a small outpost hidden in the jungle. The structure was simple, made of stone and wood, with signs of long abandoned use. It looked as though it had been built to withstand whatever dangers Savon threw at it, and for the first time since they had crashed, Caden felt a fleeting sense of relief. But Astra's expression didn't change. She didn't slow down. "This won't be enough," she said grimly. "But it's a start. We need to find out what's happening with the source before it's too late." Caden barely had time to catch his breath before Astra began preparing the outpost. She rummaged through some old supplies, pulling out what appeared to be small devices, communication tools, or perhaps something more. "What are you doing?" Caden asked, his voice still hoarse, but tinged with confusion. "I'm trying to make contact with the Council, the ones who left the outposts here," Astra said, her focus intense as she worked. "They knew about the source. They built the Guardians to protect it? But if the source is really awakening, then everything is about to change." Caden didn't understand. He barely understood what had happened in the past few hours, let alone what Astra was trying to do. But one thing was clear: the source was the key. The reason everything was happening, the reason Savon was alive with energy. And whatever it was far from over. The small outpost was eerily quiet. The walls, made of aged stone and intertwined wood, were weathered by time and neglect. Yet, despite the signs of abandonment, it was sturdy, resilient, a symbol of the ancient civilization that had once called Savon home. Astra moved quickly, her hands steady as she worked with the communication devices, her mind focused on one goal: finding answers. Caden sat nearby, his thoughts racing as he looked around the outpost. It was a relic, a ghost of a time long past. Dust covered everything, and the walls were adorned with symbols he didn't understand, symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, almost as if they were alive. They were a stark reminder of the world he had crashed into. Astra finally looked up from the device, her face set in determination. "I've made contact," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the message won't reach the Council in time. We need to move fast." Caden stood up, his eyes locked on hers. "The Council? Who are they? And why does it feel like everything here is falling apart?" Astra's expression darkened, the faint glint of concern in her silver eyes betraying her usual calm demeanor. The Council was the governing body of Savon. They were the ones who created the Guardians to protect the source, the core of the planet's power. But they disappeared long ago, leaving behind these outposts as a last line of defense. She paused, glancing back at the swirling vortex far in the distance, still visible through the jungle. Its glow had intensified, and the hum that echoed from it seemed to reverberate through the very air. They knew the source was too powerful to be left unchecked, Astra continued. But something went wrong. The Guardians were supposed to keep the source sealed away, but they failed. Caden furrowed his brow, his mind racing to catch up. And the talker? It was one of those Guardians. Astra nodded, her voice tied with a bitterness she rarely showed. Yes. The talker was one of the oldest Guardians. It wasn't just a creature, it was a force. A living weapon, created to control the source's power. But something triggered its awakening, and once the talker broke free, everything started falling apart. Caden's mind spun. So, the source has been sealed away for all this time. Not sealed, Astra corrected, her gaze distant as if remembering something from a past she preferred not to revisit. Kept dormant. But the balance has shifted. You're the catalyst, Caden. The moment you arrived, the planet began to react. The energy in the rift, the source, it's all waking up because of you. Caden's heart raced. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was overwhelming. His crash, his presence on this planet, had triggered something. Savon was no longer just a strange, hostile world, it was a planet on the brink of a cataclysmic awakening. We need to find the Council, Caden said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. If they know how to stop this, we have to find them. Astra shook her head. It's not that simple. The Council disappeared long before the Guardians were lost. Whatever was left of them is buried under layers of secrecy. There are whispers of a hidden city deep in the heart of Savon, a city where the Council might have fled after everything fell apart. But no one knows where it is. Caden stood still, trying to piece everything together. The source, the Guardians, the Council, and now the vortex that was growing stronger every moment. We'll have to find it ourselves, then, Caden said, determination hardening his voice. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. We need to reach that city before it's too late. Astra studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes searching his face as if assessing him. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded. You're right. But it's not going to be easy. The source has a way of drawing power to it. And those who seek it, they don't always survive. Caden didn't flinch. He had nothing left to lose. Let's go, then. Astra turned and started moving swiftly toward the jungle again. Caden followed, his mind still whirling with the new information. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting to stop an ancient force from awakening, one that could destroy everything in its path. But there was no turning back. Not now. The jungle stretched out before them, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels, their shadows casting eerie shapes in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and alien vegetation. The stillness of the jungle now felt oppressive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The vortex continued to swirl in the distance, its energy growing more intense. Caden could feel the pull of it in his chest, a weight that grew stronger with every step he took toward it. The source was alive, and it was waiting. Waiting for someone or something to claim its power. Astra led the way through the thick underbrush, her movements fluid and graceful. Caden struggled to keep up, his body still sore from the crash, his muscles aching with every step. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. After what felt like hours of moving through the dense jungle, they reached a large clearing. In the center of it was an ancient structure, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in vines and moss. It looked like a temple, but unlike anything Caden had ever seen before. The architecture was both alien and familiar, with intricate carvings and symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy all their own. "This is it," Astra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hidden city." Caden stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. They had found it? The place that could hold the answers they needed. But as he moved closer, he felt something stir in the air, a cold chill that crept over him like a shadow. The energy in the air was heavier here, more palpable. And it wasn't just the wind. Something was waiting inside. The hidden city loomed before them, its towering structure rising from the jungle like a forgotten monument. The vines and moss that clung to the walls gave it an ancient, weathered look, yet there was something undeniably powerful about it. The air here was thick with an energy Caden could almost feel on his skin, like static before a storm. Astra didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the surroundings with the practiced wariness of someone who had lived their entire life under the threat of death. Caden followed, his pulse quickening with anticipation. "Keep your guard up," Astra warned in a low voice, her eyes flicking to the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "This place is dangerous." Caden nodded, though his mind was spinning. This ancient city, buried deep within the heart of Savon, was more than just a remnant of the past. It was the last hope for survival. If they could uncover the secrets it held, they could find a way to stop the awakening of the source and whatever else had been triggered by its re-emergence. But as they approached the entrance of the city, a low rumble began to echo through the air. Caden froze, instinctively glancing around, but there was nothing to see. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the shadows that clung to the stone walls seemed to shift and move, as though alive. "Do you feel that?" Caden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Astra's expression hardened. "Yes. The source is near. It's reacting to us." Caden's heart skipped a beat. He had felt the pull earlier, a deep, insistent weight in his chest. It was as though the planet itself was calling to him, urging him to come closer. But Astra wasn't waiting for the source to make its move. She led him forward into the city, her pace swift and determined. Caden followed, though the tension in his chest grew with every step they took. He could feel the power of the source, thick in the air, a low hum vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. As they passed through the city's ancient gates, they entered a large central chamber. The room was vast, its walls lined with strange symbols and intricate carvings, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber stood a large pedestal, upon which rested a strange, crystalline structure. It pulsed with energy, a soft, rhythmic glow that seemed to draw Caden closer. Astra stopped a few steps ahead, her expression tense. She glanced at the pedestal, then back at Caden. "This is it? The source?" Caden stared at the crystal, his mind reeling. This was the heart of Savon. The power that had shaped the planet's very existence, the force that had guarded the world's deepest secrets. It was here, in this room, that the fate of Savon and perhaps of the universe itself would be decided. But before he could step forward, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and thunderous, like a storm approaching. "You shouldn't have come here." Caden whipped around, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. From the shadows emerged a figure tall, cloaked in dark robes, their face obscured by a hood. The figure moved forward with deliberate slowness, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the chamber. Astra stepped forward, her spear raised in a defensive posture. "I knew you'd be here." The figure laughed softly, the sound cold and mocking. "Did you think you could stop this? The source is awakening, and there's nothing you can do to change it? Caden's pulse quickened. The figure's voice was familiar, he had heard it before, but where? It clicked suddenly, a flash of memory in his mind. This wasn't just any guardian. This was someone who had been part of the council, the ones who had built the source, the ones who had disappeared. You're one of them, Caden said, his voice rising with realization. A member of the council. The figure nodded, pulling back the hood to reveal a face that was both alien and familiar. Silver eyes, glowing faintly with an eerie light, fixed on Caden. The face was older, worn by time, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about the expression. Yes, the figure said, their voice colder than the air around them. I was once part of the council. But I have learned the truth. The source must awaken. The power it holds cannot be sealed away any longer. Astra stepped forward, her voice hard with anger. You were a part of the council. But now you've become a tool for the source. A servant of its power. The figure's lips curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it. You don't understand. The source is not just a power. It's a gateway, a bridge to something far greater. You think you can stop it, but it's too late. The source has already chosen. Caden's mind spun. The source wasn't just energy, it was a gateway, a portal to something else. And this figure, this former member of the council, was its servant. It had all been planned. Before Caden could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again. The crystal on the pedestal pulsed faster now, its glow intensifying. The air was thick with power, the hum almost deafening as the source stirred. We're running out of time, Astra said urgently. We need to act now. The figure's smile widened as he raised a hand, and the room began to shift. The walls seemed to bend and twist, as if the space itself was warping. There is no more time, he said, his voice filled with finality. The source will reshape this world, and you will be part of its awakening. Without warning, the figure's hands crackled with energy, and a blast of force shot out toward Caden and Astra. Caden's heart pounded as he pushed himself forward, grabbing Astra and pulling her to the ground just as the blast collided with the stone wall behind them, sending rocks and debris scattering. Caden's body ached with the impact, but Astra was already on her feet, her spear raised. The figure moved, but this time, it was different. The power from the source had begun to consume him, turning him into something else entirely. Something more dangerous. Something unstoppable. We fight now, Astra said, her voice grim. And with that, the final battle for Savon and for their lives began. The source trembled as the world around us cracked open. The ancient guardians, the jungle, even the very sky, everything was breaking apart. I stood there, looking at Astra, my heart racing as the energy of the source pulsed through me, through us. And suddenly, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger. We had fought, we had survived, but could we actually win? Could love between two worlds really survive the end of everything we knew? I thought I was ready to face the end. But then I realized something, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning of a whole new universe. And in that final moment, I had a choice. To stay, and let love guide us, or to leave it all behind and walk away from the unknown. Could I walk away from Astra? From a love that could tear the fabric of reality apart? You see, the universe doesn't care if you're ready. It doesn't care if you understand. It only cares if you choose to stay, or if you choose to leave. So, what's next for us? Can love defy the laws of the universe, or will we be consumed by the very thing we sought to control? But here's the real question. What do you believe? Will humanity ever find love beyond Earth? Or is the search nothing more than a wild dream? Join me. Hit subscribe, and let's keep this journey going. You're now a part of this intergalactic adventure, and together, we will uncover the truth that lies beyond the stars.